Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
Oh, Jeremy, it's I think
May
that
you
it's
live in
just,
interesting times.
may we live in interesting times indeed. And indeed it is interesting times. I got to say that perhaps the state of media might be worse than ever right now, especially after the meeting between the two god emperors that are going to save our civilization, and save us all from imminent catastrophe. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin just met, and you're getting the typical reactions. Amplified by 1,000 from people on both sides of the spectrum, whether it's on the patriot, Trump and Putin are going to team up to save the world side, or else it's the DC consensus. Putin is the cause of all evil in the world. Everything from cyber hacking to stumping my toe this morning. They're all putting out their typical BS narratives times 1,000. But I think that thankfully we've got something other than that topic to talk about today, because I don't know if I can make it through just talking about the whole Putin Trump angle for 58 minutes. So thankfully we've got another topic to deal with, though I feel is an extremely important one as well, and I'm sure you'll concur with that. I just recently, this past week, wrote a blog for and I'm going to be putting it out on our page, and I'm putting out where people can find it here after we get off this show. Actually, I wrote a blog about particularly about two individuals in particular, Robbie Martin, creator of a documentary titled "Very Heavy Agenda," which gets into the post-Cold War rebranding of the post-September 11th rebranding of the Project for New American Century as the Foreign Policy Initiative, and how it has targeted Russia. And it actually, in a lot of ways, is very important what the information disclosed that he's putting out, but at the same time, I feel it does miss some important information, particularly related to who actually was responsible for September 11th and other things. But goal here in mentioning this article is not to, or in this documentary, is not to get in depth with whatever pros and cons there may be of it. But Robbie Martin was the creator of this documentary. His sister Abby is the host of the Empire Files program on Telesur, which is the Venezuelan state television network, and was former host of the Breaking the Set program on Russia Today. I wrote an article about how I believe that Robbie Martin in particular exhibits a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to people that he he describes himself as being a truther and as being a person who is who represents how people who have serious questions about what may or may not have happened on September 11th are supposed to act. He likes to model himself as being like the model for how all truthers should behave and operate. And I pointed out that he has some very interesting, I think in a lot of ways, hypocritical standards in how he judges what qualifies for credibility and what qualifies for journalistic standards. And I compared and contrasted his reaction to a couple of journalists in particular, a journalist named Caitlin Johnstone, who is an Australian progressive who writes for Medium.com, and a few others who have been writing a lot about their beliefs that Seth Rich may have been murdered by elements within the DNC to cover, because he was about to blow the whistle on he was actually the source of the leaks which proved that the Democratic primary was rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders, and that the Democratic Party elites had conspired to do this. So Caitlin Johnstone and some other progressive muckrakers who have been doing this kind of work, and I'm not totally in line with them, but at the same time, I can see where they have this belief. Robbie Martin's been really critical of these people. He's even claimed that Caitlin Johnstone, as well as the actual guy who's heading the attorney for the people that are suing the Democratic National Committee, Jared Beck, he has asserted that they are dupes for the alt-right. And what he's gone on is a couple of articles that Johnstone has written about saying that people, principled progressives need to align with people on the other side of the spectrum. And I got to say that, unfortunately, she cited Mike Cernovich as an example of somebody who principled progressives should be willing to form an alliance with. And by the way, I do not agree with that. And you can figure out the obvious reasons why I don't agree with aligning with someone like Mike Cernovich. I think he's a very odiously destructive influence. But that's the basis of what Caitlin Johnstone has said, and she's earned the wrath of Robbie Martin for this, and I think for really putting out a lot of information about the Seth Rich case. We've talked about the Seth Rich case. We've talked about our reasons why we don't just automatically buy the line from the alternative media about what happened with Seth Rich. But we also talked about why something, the possibility of him being offed by some actual entities within the quote unquote deep state is also a viable, realistic possibility as well. So we don't need to rehash that. But so Robbie Martin's very much not happy with these people. He sees them, I guess, as a detriment to progressivism and to anti-war causes because they're pushing what he believes are unsubstantiated theories about Seth Rich, and he very much lumps them in with the people who put out a lot of the Pizzagate information, and also sees them as being dupes for the alt, calls them. But meanwhile, who do Robbie Martin and his sister, who do they associate with very closely? Well, namely Max Blumenthal. And we've gone in depth about Max Blumenthal and what he represents and his actions in helping his father and Hillary Clinton actually promote propaganda regarding the whole Libya and Syria both, as well as the Benghazi attacks. We've talked in depth about him and some of his pals, including Benjamin Norton and Rania Khalek. All these people have had this rebranding where they've done this 180 on the topic of Syria over the past couple of years, and they've gone from full-blown just demonizing and vilifying everything related to Bashar al-Assad to being now the principled opposition to the efforts to try and destabilize and destroy Syria. And we talked about the conveniency behind that. And I get into all this in this article, and I also talk about Mike Preisner, who's Abby Martin's producer, also her significant other. He's the producer on the Empire Files. And the commonality that all these people have is that they've all been very hostile to what Robbie Martin claims to represent, which is trutherism. They've all put out public statements where they've either criticized and mocked 9/11 truthers, or else they've just been downright just disparaging. And so I've pointed out these examples, and I've said, and I raised the question, why these people acceptable to associate with, but yet these progressives who seem to actually in many ways be on the more principled side when it comes to actually not falling for actually condemning all of a lot of the dupes within the Democratic Party. And now these people who supported Bernie Sanders are becoming more and more critical of Sanders. So I find that interesting, as opposed to a Young Turks style outlet which always ends up carrying water for whoever the Democrats are promoting at the time. Despite how they may portray themselves as being anti-establishment. Of course, Abby Martin just co-hosted with the Young Turks a few weeks ago. So, Robbie's got a lot of issues. Robbie and Abby Martin both have a lot of issues with who they're willing to condemn and who they're not willing to condemn. In a lot of ways, I think the people that they're not willing to criticize or willing to proclaim as allies are actually, in a lot of ways, might be more nefarious than those who Robbie Martin is spending a substantial portion of his time criticizing. And so I've written an article about that, and I've raised a lot of questions about these people and who and what they represent. And I'm also about to start working on another article where I'm about to take another important figure in this whole in the alternative sphere, so to speak, and that is another person we've talked ad nauseum about, and we'll continue to talk about, I'm sure, because it's an important point to continue hammering home, is Alex Jones, and how Alex Jones's views over the years have watered down, and he's backtracked on a lot of the things he said in the past, which is similar to how Abby and Robbie Martin in their association with the Max Blumenthal types, it's correlated with a watering down of principled views that they've long held about false flag terror, as well as some of the myths that keep this fake system alive, the fake political system, the fake monetary economic system alive. And I've noticed a correlation where the Martins have had a backtracking in their views with coinciding with becoming established, entrenched in these more influential circles where you've got a bigger base, you've got more followers, you've got more of a platform than you had prior. And I've noticed the same things happening with Alex Jones and InfoWars and people associated with that. And one of the key figures that I've identified with what's happening with Alex Jones, I'm going to write about in this article, and the people around Alex Jones, a similar role that, say, a Max Blumenthal plays, is David Horowitz. And there are other people as well. Jerome Corsi's an example of this, how, Alex Jones now openly has a guy who has written entire books about the imminent threat that, Iran's nuclear program possesses to the free world. He's now their D.C. press correspondent. So there's other examples, but I think David Horowitz is a really powerful example because Alex Jones, in interviewing David Horowitz a couple of months ago, went on, made a big deal that, I used to not see the world the way David Horowitz sees it, but I have been educated, and 15 years ago, the things David Horowitz was warning about, he was 95% correct about. And basically what Alex Jones is doing is like a big mea culpa on air. He's things that I was advocating for 15 years ago, which are the truth about September 11th and false flags and the illusion of the system that we live in, as far as like both the left and the right being complicit in creating a false reality. You see, that wasn't really the real truth of the matter. The real truth of the matter is what people like David Horowitz and Pamela Geller have been talking about all this time, and that is the fact that it's not that Muslims are falsely accused of are falsely blamed and framed for terror attacks which create perpetual state of warfare. No, it's that the Muslims are actually in alliance with the left and with the globalists and with people like George Soros to bring down our civilization. You see, that's the real crux of the root of the problem. And basically, of course, that issue goes along everybody but Donald Trump and people that are in line with Donald Trump's MAGA, America First agenda are the enemy, basically. So Alex Jones went on this mea culpa and explaining how David Horowitz really was right all this time. He didn't see the light until just recently. And so I've written the first article about the Abby and Robbie Martin. I'm going to start working on the second article about Alex Jones. I hope to have that out, I want to say by the end of this coming week. And so I think that these two articles and the individuals that are going to be focused on in these articles are great examples of how when you get an increased platform, how in many cases the topics that you're willing to discuss and talk about, and where at one point you were willing to talk about things that were more controversial, there were more, I think, more of a threat to this actual system, to bringing down this system that we live in. It was actually more uniting people and getting out of this false paradigm than where people like Abby Martin and Robbie Martin and Alex Jones are with their current dialogue and their current worldview that they're currently putting out. So I've established these parallels and these similarities, and I think that it makes a great case. And I think you can make a point that people like Max Blumenthal and David Horowitz act very similarly in how they are, I think, are serving as maybe controllers of discourse for the people who are within their respective sphere of influence.
Well, thank you for breaking all that down, Greg. And we have asserted incendiary hypotheses of parallel process in a way in the past, where we've compared David Duke to Noam Chomsky. And I'm sure that sounds
Well, I bet a lot of people don't like to hear that one.
Yeah, I imagine the acolytes of both of these clear icons, these iconographical symbols of the intellectual alt-right and the intellectual alt-left, are probably angry on both sides by that type of comparison. But we've pointed out how it's very apt, and not that they're the same or similar type of figures, but that the role that they play is similar in terms of how they control the narrative and the discourse, and especially the narrative and the discourse around things such as Zionist politics, Jewish power, these types of things. Well, David Duke apparently might emphasize it and highlight Jewish power as the sort of the only credible driver of global politics in a way, and then hand all of that analysis over to politics such as white nationalism in service of Donald Trump candidacy, while not really deconstructing the actual nature of such things as September 11th and the ongoing war on terror and Trump's obvious background of compromise and political closeness to the networks that played a very material and central role to the actual September 11th.
It's all Jared, Jeremy. It's all Jared Kushner. That's all we need to know. It's all Jared's just manipulating him. That's all.
And questions, of course, about these obvious, pretty clearly hardcore Jewish Zionist son-in-laws of both of the candidates in this last go-around, and they're both the relations of both candidates over a long term to such a figure as Jeffrey Epstein, who we should remind people that a key player in the Jeffrey Epstein network was not only all of the Hollywood people that he associated, not all of the high-level scientists or the Prince Andrew in British high society, but also a figure like Ehud Barak, not only a former prime minister, but a former head of Israeli military intelligence. And we've already discussed the role of the daughter of pretty clear Mossad asset agent Robert Maxwell, his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell, and the controlled aspect of this narrative can be seen in such things as the blanking out by people such as David Duke during the 2016 campaign to these kind of hard facts and hard questions about Donald Trump's background and the Jewish-Russian mob ties in the New York area, and the Roy Cohn advisor, mentor, very best friend from Donald Trump, and for Donald Trump to actually identify his very best friend when he has so many terrific guys, good friends, great friends, backslapping, kind of people, that's a big deal. And so we see this blank out of the David Duke type figures, and then also the Noam Chomsky set, who has a tendency in a counter way to always underplay or underemphasize or run cover for things such as Zionist politics and Jewish power, where he's always calling the Israel lobby is a myth in terms of the power. He calls it just, it's just an ethnic lobby. Sure, it's powerful, but, it's just one of many ethnic lobbies in the United States. And of course, the power of the military-industrial complex and the actual business power in the United States could shut it down in 1 second if it were an actual threat to American national interests. And of course...
And in addition to that, in addition to that, Chomsky always comes out every 4 years to implore his followers that if you're in a state that could influence an election, you got to hold your breath and vote for the Democrat.
There you go. And so the actual way that this plays out materially, not only in terms of intellectual understanding, with Chomsky for some reason not being able to see that that Jewish power, and it's obviously not just Jewish power. There's no any high-level anti-Zionist or even non-Zionist Jews in these very high places of social and business and media and financial and political power. It's a very specific, not only an ethno-religious lobby, but also a political power syndicate, a Zionist power configuration that Chomsky somehow is not able to see. So we see these types of figures symbolizing in some way the controlled nature of the debate left and right, that then also trickles down in a certain way or out to such alternative media figures as the Max Blumenthals and the Abby and Robbie Martin on the left, and then the Alex Joneses and his increasing relationship with figures such as David Horowitz, as you identified, but also people like Michael Savage and Jerome Corsi and the WorldNet Daily and the Pamela Geller Network.
Roger Stone's another one. Roger Stone.
Yes. So this is a key to understanding the nature of thought control. And the point is not to try to identify agents, assets, operatives, these types of things. Although in some cases it seems very obvious, people should look at an analysis of people like David Duke that you have contributed to, Greg, and his pretty obvious background that looks like something like an intelligence agent of some sort, from his relationship with Air America, CIA operations back during Vietnam War era, to his father. It's these types of things. But then people should also go look at Noam Chomsky. James Corbett has done interesting reports on Noam Chomsky, but even an interesting analyst called Miles Mathis has done some very interesting background analysis of Chomsky. And Miles Mathis, like some other people, who are probably coming from the left, such as like Barry Zwicker, who's written one of the more important books about 9/11 truth, in specific in relationship to the media part of it, the media cover-up of September 11th, has a whole chapter about Noam Chomsky and the shame of the left gatekeepers. And there's a lot of material in there that needs to be unpacked. So these are, whether it's Barry Zwicker or Miles Mathis, these are both people who have had a background in looking up to, supporting Noam Chomsky's analysis. These are not, sort of like right-wing haters of Noam Chomsky. These are actually maybe people who are more faithful to a left liberal analysis than Chomsky even is. So then when it comes to people like Alex Jones sidling back up to a David Horowitz, and then people like Robbie and Abby Martin sidling up to Max Blumenthal, especially in a day and age where in this Trump era, where partisanship has become even more an intense organizer of our common discourse. Then we have to begin to think about deconstructing a reactionary politics that begins to sort of play left and right and punch sideways, rather than still focusing on our oligarchical wannabe masters, the powers that want it to be, may we call them, and work towards holding them accountable to rule of law. But in order to do that, we're not going to be able to play this game from more intensely and severely retrenched positions of left and right. It doesn't mean that we can't have ideological positions or come from ideological stances or understandings in relationship to our political commitments. It just means that we need to be very, very careful about being directed towards a horizontalism of political warfare that distracts us and runs cover for the actual top-down organizing powers that really do not have much to do with political understanding left to right, other than in a sort of more micro context, I would say, in terms of the United States and the position that we had in the Cold War, and there's, whether it's the Wall Street backing of British intelligence, connections to things not only like Hitler but also Stalin, even back to Lenin, these types of things, then we begin to see, this long-term left-right split might actually have been a strategic division, global geopolitical division that was then used to organize the ascent of police states, warfare. And it was called the Cold War, right? But it was very, very hot for millions and millions of people who lost their lives at the hands, most intensely of the U.S. side of the equation around the world. But then you can also point out the suffering at the Soviets at the hands of millions and millions of people in Eurasia. So there are no innocent parties here, and in order to unlock this, we need to rethink our politics from, I would say, a first principles situation where we can use terms. If people are interested in using terms like communism or capitalism, fine. But don't rest on terminology in order to develop your thinking, or assume that when you use words like that everybody knows what you're thinking. And I would say forget using those words. Let's actually describe what we're talking about. Because a lot of times when people from the right maybe say that they're pro-capitalist, and then they're immediately, reacted to by people on the left who see themselves as anti-capitalist, there might be more agreement there. I'm sure there's disagreement at some level, but I imagine there's some agreement there in another way. If you were to describe, okay, we don't want the government controlling all of our commerce, all of our personal lives. At the same time, we want people to be able to organize themselves and have a democratic approach to commerce, where we, the people, are at the top of the political food chain, and then underneath us is our governments, and then underneath them in terms of charters are corporations. So these are very basic things like a hierarchy of sovereignty, where there's the commons, we have the actual natural commons, where if there didn't exist water, air, land, and even into the what we might call the human commons, or the artificial commons, meaning not fake, but artifact commons, such as things like language, things such as technology, culture, the cultural commons. These are the things that we all would have to admit that we all depend on in some way. So that is the wellspring of any real political strategy that's both principled and pragmatic. And then from that, you see the private individual and the private individuals. And this is some of the best out of the Western tradition and the American tradition, and understanding that we the people are actually hold the political sovereignty, and then delegate a limited amount of that down to the public sector, i.e. our governments, to be able to mediate, protect the not only the private rights but also potentially the common rights. And then from there you have the corporate sector, where charters are given out by the states, literally. Think about Delaware. The history of the corporations and their charters are an interesting one in the United States, and people should look at that. And then so that is a logical way of thinking about politics. We need to rebuild our politics from the ground up, I would say, and not sort of just spin out on each other in relationship to guilt by association. On the other side of that is credibility by association. And we should not be afraid of associating. And at the same time, we should not depend on our associations to come to the table with credibility. Our political credibility should be based on our willingness to bring truth to the table, honesty to the table, a principled commitment that way transcends either ideology or partisanship. And then also practical vision, strategic wisdom, we might call it, about, okay, we can bicker all we want about what the nature of the problem is and how we're going to address that, but what is the actual vision of what we want to create together? So I think all of that plays into what you're identifying in terms of some of the problems of the retrenchment, of the backtracking by these key figures in the alternative media, left and right, specifically around things like September 11th, that seems to go along, at the very least in a temporal way, in the last few years, with the further splitting, the re-splitting of politics. The center is not holding. The left and right have spun off. And, thinking about people like Abby Martin and Robbie Martin, that they used to have some kind of working relationship with Alex Jones and the InfoWars crew. And there was a sense of that they could work, even though they definitely came from the left. They were willing to work with, libertarians and patriots of good faith from the right. This was the era where there was a sense of that someone like Ron Paul could get together with a Dennis Kucinich for a real bottom-up type of bipartisan approach. And that all sort of got shut down in some way, and we're seeing the fallout of that now as people begin to retrench into their controlled left and right positions, and at the same time go backwards on these very key political truths like September 11th and who did it for what reason.
Indeed, I wanted to say that you made a very important point just now, and that was that in the past, yes, they were all about it. I just remember just no more than 2 or 3 years ago, one of the main points that Abby Martin would hammer home on their podcasts is that, look, we need to be coming together with people like, anti-war libertarians and anti-war progressives need to come together on this stuff, and we need to forge alliances. She would talk all the time about how, the Tea Party was initially just a bipartisan in many ways of like people that were outside of the mainstream spectrum and how they needed to come together. Now, of course, the problem, one of the biggest problems is that these movements become so splintered, and that the libertarian conservative, anti-establishment types now have just so gone extreme hardcore into buying into this whole, Clash of Civilizations narrative that, that the ultimate enemy is Islam and the left, rather than just like the entire system, which was being labeled and correctly identified as being like our common enemy before. But this is precisely the same thing that Caitlin Johnstone, that Robbie Martin seems to be so upset with Caitlin Johnstone for saying, and as I don't agree with her belief that we should align people like Mike Cernovich, because I don't think there's any sort of good solutions that are going to come from the Mike Cernovich crowd. But that's precisely what they were doing, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, or even more recently when they were aligning with Alex Jones, when Abby Martin was together with Alex Jones at the Bilderberg conference and was working with Luke Rudkowski and people like that. That's the exact same thing that Caitlin Johnstone was doing, that was advocating for now. And so it's funny that they've gone so far from that they've gone so far in their thinking that even the idea of aligning with people that they would at one point were willing to align with and actually did align with, who they now find, I think, correctly to be nefarious influences. It's funny that that's the thing that they are all over this, that he's all over this Caitlin Johnstone about, is the same thing that they were advocating for just a few years ago. And despite the changing in the game of the dynamics and of where these respective movements lie now in terms of where their ideology lies, it's still interesting that is pretty much the same thing. And perhaps, maybe a Caitlin Johnstone doesn't understand exactly what a Mike Cernovich represents. We don't know that for sure. Of course, Robbie Martin, I think just on his Twitter the other day, was saying that, at one point I could have been, I could be condemned for associating with the Alex Jones crowd at one point, but I didn't know what they represented, so I made a mistake in aligning with them, and I own up to it. It could be the same thing. It could be that maybe she's not a dupe for the alt-right, as he likes to say, or that but it could just be that maybe she doesn't know what he's all about. Maybe she thinks that his supporters genuinely get some good information from sharing and promoting her stuff. We don't know, but it is interesting that this is where that this is what he's all over this particular individual about. So I find that really interesting. I'm glad you tied in all the stuff with the linking Noam Chomsky and David Duke and how these icons of their respective movements, how they have these similar outlooks and similar intents and similar goals at the end of the day. I think the same could be true for, say, a David Horowitz and a Max Blumenthal, who are similar to Duke and Chomsky, serve as icons in many ways. And it is funny, it is interesting how the downplaying and the watering down of beliefs and the correlation with gaining a bigger audience and a bigger platform always seems the thing that's not welcome in these respective movements. It is questions about things like September 11th and false flag terrorism, and those always seem to be the things that are never allowed in these kind of controlled dialogue movements. That's whether you're associating with Ben Norton and Rania Khalek and Max Blumenthal, or whether you're making inroads with Michael Savage and Jerome Corsi and David Horowitz and Pamela Geller. The thing that seems to be in common is that discussion of real deep discussion of false flag terrorism and the myths that create these perpetual warfare. That's just not allowed or welcomed in these circles, and they take their dialogue and their rhetoric and they act accordingly to fit these standards of what I call censorship in a lot of ways. And there seems to be a shaming of it in this aspect, that they seem in many ways that they're ashamed of their backgrounds, of their past, and that they're trying to make amends for it. And while I think there's more evidence personally that Alex has always served some type of role as a willing asset, at the very least, of some type, going back through his history of how he came up and his family's connections, and his father being a dentist for working on prominent CIA officials and all that, and his cousin and their activities I believe in Guatemala during when all the covert Reagan administration, the anti-communist action was taking place down there. I think there's more evidence that you could look at with, say, that maybe an Alex Jones has been a long-term, actual, willing asset of some type than, and then an Abby and Robbie Martin. But either way, when you look at these people, it is very similar that they have backtracked and watered down their respective philosophies on the same issues. And that is, I think that's key to understanding what the purpose of, what the role of, say, a Max Blumenthal or a David Horowitz or some of these other individuals that have now latched themselves on to these respective figures on both the alternative left and the alternative right. That is important understanding, I think, their MO, and that a large part of their operation is to discourage people from looking into the facts of these events and what really happened with, say, on 11/22/63 or on 9/11/01 or these other consequential, fateful dates in history. And you also talked about you also mentioned how you were following up on what I said about how, in a lot of ways, these people, whether it's a Robbie Martin or an Abby Martin or an Alex Jones, with their previous stance on these matters, with their more principled, more honest assessment of the false flag nature of terrorism, as well as the false paradigms of our economic system, our monetary system, the myths that keep this system up and running, that they were much closer to actually breaking out of this paradigm and this fake system in the past than they are now, where it seems that they've fallen into these false paradigms that they at one point pretty much, I think for the most part, saw through. And there's an example here with both sides use the demonization of the people who they're opposed to, whether it's the Alex Jones crowd just making Muslims and liberals and migrant, all to be the enemy. They're the other. They're the enemy that we're out against. It's where the Abby Martin crowd, where I think she's been in a lot of ways negatively influenced by someone like Mike Preisner, is that they see racism and sexism and bigotry as being it's not just byproducts of the system, the actual false system that we live in, but that's actually the main thing that we need to focus on. And I posted this thread where the co-founder of the San Diego 9/11 Truth Group, Peter Holmes, had actually called out and questioned Abby Martin about on an old episode of on her old RT show back in 2013, where she did not ask Noam Chomsky during an interview she did with him any questions about like his stance on September 11th or on some of the other issues where he has been particularly deceptive over the years. And, Abby started talking about how, we can't constantly focus on this and this and this. And, that's a fair point to make to an extent. We can have a fair dialogue about just how much these events should be emphasized. I think that's more than a fair enough conversation to have, and how much an event like September 11th and other false flag type events should be analyzed. That's a fair conversation to have. But then Mike Preisner, who I'd point out uses two different accounts to just start verbally harassing and slandering Peter Holmes and calling him a racist and a sexist for bringing this stuff up. On one hand, he's saying that, look, this is not important in the grand scheme of things. It's, understanding false flag terrorism and understanding the fraudulent nature of the Federal Reserve Bank is not important in the long run in terms of bringing down this system. We've got to focus on how these people, it's all about just capitalism and wanting to make profit and holding down people and bigotry and sexism and all this. Those are the real keys. And it's just like David Horowitz, Alex Jones learning from David Horowitz, that the real problem is not false flags and the perpetual wars that come from them. No, it's the fact that the people who are actually suffering the most from our foreign policy are actually in line with the people who are bringing down our civilization, and that's where the real conspiracy lies. So there's so much of a similarity here, and so it seems that this was 4 years ago. How much has Abby Martin's worldview evolved in the last 4 years, where she was already allowing this guy to use duplicate accounts to attack a person who she was once a close ally of in the September 11th accountability movement? Where is she at now with this whole idea that it doesn't matter what the Federal Reserve is a fake, is a false, represents a false monetary system. It doesn't matter that, that John F. Kennedy, our president, was assassinated by people within this government. It doesn't matter that who actually was responsible for September 11th, and actually revealing that is not important. No, what's important is this whole breaking down the bigotry and the sexism and the capitalism, the rampant capitalism. Capitalism's the reason for all this stuff, not the fraudulent nature of the system in general and the myths which allow it to keep running. No, it's just capitalism. So in this case, they've gone so far from like an actual breaking down of this paradigm from where they were just 4 or 5 years ago to where they're at now with this constant right baiting, and it's the same thing that the InfoWars and people and like Paul Joseph Watson types do now, where it's just left baiting. They're doing the same thing with the right baiting, and they've almost in many ways gone 180 from an actual like stance and an actual course of action that would help to break down and tear down this false system that we live in, where now they've just become, whether they realize it or not, I think they've become partisan dupes in a lot of ways. And I think that this is a very damaging trend that we've seen develop here over the past few years.
Yes, and these examples of right and left that you've given of where, I would say that to be fair, it's this idea that, okay, there's this thing being put forth that there's these bigger structural reasons for these maybe smaller events. Maybe if you're talking about what Mike Preisner and Abby might assert around things like deep events, state crimes against democracy, state crimes against the mind, as I've termed it, and the Federal Reserve and the fraudulent monetary system. These are sort of just symptoms of the capitalist system. Fair argument. At the same time, there's this bait and switch in a way, because then when it actually comes down to an authentic conversation of Peter Holmes wanting to have a conversation about the Abby and her new position in the media world, and this access to someone like Noam Chomsky, who was obviously identified as a 9/11 gatekeeper of sorts for whatever reason, did not use her access to question Chomsky on what's an obvious important position of our times. If there is a singular event of the 21st century that's shaped the illegal aggressive warfare that's ended up in the death and destruction of millions of human lives, it is September 11th and the ongoing narrative around that. And Chomsky's on the wrong side of history in relationship to that. And Abby did not utilize
so are Blumenthal and David Horowitz, people like that for that matter. They're on the wrong side of history too. So
that's true. And so then once this conversation actually gets opened up in a potentially productive way between a former co-activist and ally Peter Holmes and Abby Martin, then Mike Preisner jumps in with troll accounts to then utilize the sort of the hammer of the accusation of white male privilege, sexism, racism, to me it looks like in that thread that you've outlined that Peter Holmes is actually respecting Abby as a fully empowered woman much more than Mike's position is, where he has to step in to defend her in a sort of a fairly dishonest fashion intellectually. And then what's really gets missed in all of that is that there's this actual larger aspect of structural critique and analysis of the system which we live under that's being held back, because things like the Federal Reserve System and the weaponized monetary system are structural. They are structural elements to the way that the economic system is organized. The idea of false scarcity is constructed, where money becomes a way not only to buy off your political functionaries, but to also limit your political opponents. Then things like September 11th as indicative of this national so-called security apparatus that operates on the terrain of information warfare, the assault on the mind, the poisoning of the mind as the key. The state crimes against the mind are the fundamental operations, ongoing operations, because it's not just the...
I like that, Jeremy. You've coined a new phrase, state crimes against the mind, scams. How about that?
And it's not just the originating scams, it's also the ongoing doubling, tripling down of the interpretation of the scam. That for some reason these dissident class type of people like Chomsky and Blumenthal and Horowitz and all of Alex Jones's new friends apparently are all somehow they're all on the wrong side of history, and they're on the wrong side of the truth and the facts, right? So there's a problem there, because it is also a structural characteristic of the system that deception based on a security apparatus that hides behind a secrecy regime is part and parcel of the structural nature of the ongoing economic and political warfare against all of us on the planet. So that is a key recognition here, and that's similarly played out with the Alex Jones crowd and David Horowitz and Michael Savage, where it becomes all about the left and the liberal media and those Muslims and the Clintons and George Soros, and it's just perpetually, and then also the identity politics that's all wrapped up in all of that, and that there is a sort of a white nationalist dog whistling that's part and parcel of the Cambridge Analytica psychographical warfare that was waged on groups on the right in order to sort of smooth the ascent of the New American Home Party, represented by aspects that back Trump. And so the interpretation of things like such as Russia, the relationship of Trump to Putin, the United States to Russia, how that relates to things like Syria, this New Deal. What is the role of this missing close guy on the ground, Netanyahu, who was very tied in, of course, to September 11th, talking every Sunday to Larry Silverstein. And this then leads to a sort of polarization of interpretations around something like that, where we miss the key negative influence of a player like Benjamin Netanyahu and how tied in he is, and people like Avigdor Lieberman are, to the aspects of the Jewish Zionist oligarchs that remain in Putin's Russian circles, the Israel as the sort of middle party in this World War IV ongoing scenario, which is global gladio with Islam, and then aspects of traditional and progressive society that oppose Israeli occupation and colonialism and Jewish supremacist power networks around the world. And then also missing in that factor is things like, what is the role of the deep U.S. Military and patriotic intelligence establishment? Are they trying to take back an asset away from Netanyahu in the realm of a Trump? Sort of similar, I would assert, to what happened with Obama in some ways, where the aspects of his CIA background and probably people in that milieu decided to maybe take him back a little bit from his Zionist involvement in Chicago, and where they then pushed things like a detente with Iran, a calling to account of the false flag in Ghouta, and people like the then head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, who was a key player in standing down Obama of escalating the war in Syria. And then sort of simplistic narratives about Syria, that it's all about whether Assad's going to be replaced or not. But when you go look back at the Clean Break program, the Clean Break doctrine, it says things like replacing Saddam Hussein, but rolling back the Syrian government. And at the time of the 2013 Ghouta false flag, you can see the reporting of the New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief reporting that the Israeli establishment was not, they wanted both sides to bleed in terms of this Syria operation.
Jeremy, I wanted to cut you off real quick. I wanted to ask you, was that the reporting of Jody Rudoran, who I believe has a relative who serves in the Israel Defense Forces?
Yes, I believe so. And so that needs to be considered here, that it's not as simple as is Assad going to be replaced. And then this also reminds me of this I want to update this story of Michael Kaydar, which is also a story where you can see the controlled left and the controlled right having not done any follow-up to how deep this story actually goes. And this Israeli teen was arrested after hundreds of threats, of bomb threats. He actually threatened a former Pentagon and CIA official. He threatened and extorted another U.S. politician. Meanwhile, I'm the only Jewish guy under indictment by elements of the Jewish federations still to this day, over a year after I was arrested in the process of speaking out against terrorism, against state-sponsored terrorism, against Jewish people included, and then this guy, Michael Kaydar, there's this sort of escalation of the threats, and then in 2017 he's then arrested. But there's not much follow-up. His name is sealed. His face is not to be seen in the Israeli press. But meanwhile, we know his name, Michael Kaydar. And we know that his uncle, apparently, is Mordecai Kadar, a long-term Shabak Shin Bet trainer at Bar Ilan University, who's been called for the so-called moral use of the threat of rape as a proper IDF tactic in their war against the Palestinians. Then there's a question about his mother. Is Michael Kadar's mother Tamar Kadar, a scientist in a Israeli biowarfare weapons lab, that it was reported back in the late 90s out of British newspapers, and then even followed up by Wired magazine, that there was a ethnic-specific bioweapon to be targeted against Arabs that was apparently being developed inside of, I believe, that institute. So these are serious questions that need to be asked, and no one, including Linda Sarsour, is following up these questions while she collaborated with Jewish and Zionist groups around that time to sort of support the narrative of the sort of domestic right-wing white supremacist threat that these threats against the Jewish community centers actually supposedly represented. Then it looks like Michael Kaydar is autistic. Then I found out that there's actually a unit 9900 in the Israeli military. That's their visual intelligence unit. But inside of that there's a substantial portion of autistic Israeli young people who, if they had not been brought into that program, and there's this larger program called Ro'im Rashok, RO'Im, then Rashok, RACHOK, Hebrew for seeing into the future, a program that helps students with autism prepare for enlistment in the IDF. And this is just from an article at The Atlantic about the Israeli Army's usage of autistic children. And so this needs to be looked at. This guy, Michael Kaydar, the cover-up in Israel hints at an Israeli intelligence operation. When is he going to be, brought to the United States to serve, to face trial? What are the role of his family in all of this? And where are people like Alex Jones, David Horowitz, Robbie and Abby Martin, Max Blumenthal on following this story up? Because it's key to the nature of the structural usage of terrorism, even terrorism that's targeted at Jewish American people in service of the larger Israeli, let's call it the deep Jewish state's usage of anti-Semitic paranoia matrix to advance their geopolitical cause. So yes. I would have people look into stories like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking that down, and I can, so vitally important, and this is a new layer into this whole Kadar case of the Jewish Community Center case that we were really looking at, and with the benefit of hindsight, this would definitely make a ton of sense for a number of reasons. Anyway, I guess I'm about out of time here, but till next time, just keep on thinking critically, and just don't be ashamed of speaking the truth, the hard truths, even if it gets you, regardless of how it gets you perceived. Just don't be ashamed of speaking the hard truths. We're on the right side of history here, and let's just keep it up.
Yes, thank you very much, Greg. And in our last minute here, I'd like to propose people to look into things like spiral dynamics. And there's a philosopher, Ken Wilber, who started the Integral Institute. And although a lot of his thinking has been used by people alleging a third way politics that then was taken up by people like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, war criminals like that, I think some of what he's actually talking about, he wrote an article about Trump and the ascent of Trump so that the liberals could understand what it meant. And people should look at this idea of spiral dynamics to understand that people come at different cognitive stages in terms of their political understanding. And we're at a place where the leading edge of cognitive understanding has sort of failed their political role. And so I would propose we who are willing to speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, in combination with a vision, an integral vision based on potential permacultural understandings of latent abundance that we can unleash, we need to take the narrative lead here. And in order to do that, we cannot create politics of reaction. We need to create a politics of advancement and of and foresight and strategic and beautiful vision. So the political antidote, we're out. Peace.